Hello, everybody. Welcome to one more class. Now you are gonna learn a few adverbs. Cool. And so you already learned a piece of grammar. You learned how to conjugate verbs. Now you're gonna learn the adverbs, and then we are gonna go to vocabulary and perhaps writing. Cool. So what is an adverb? An adverb is a word that modifies a verb, an adverb, and an adjective. Cool. For example, ultimately. So what is the definition of ultimately? When do I use it? Ultimately is primarily an adverb of time, specifically categorized as an adverb that indicates a final result or event outcome. Moreover, it is also used in three primary ways: to show a final result after a process, to emphasize a fundamental truth, or to act as a transition to a conclusion. For example, final result. So after a process or delay. Cool. This usage indicates that something happened at the end of a long or complicated series of events. Let's see. So after years of rising maintenance costs, the city ultimately decided to abandon the historic bridge project. See? And abandon, which was the verb you learned. The hikers were ultimately forced to abandon their gear to reach safety before the storm hit. Despite several attempts to repair the ship, the crew ultimately had to abandon it in the middle of the Atlantic, the ocean. Okay? So this is final result. Final result. An easy one. We were playing soccer and ultimately we lost. Cool? Or and ultimately we won because we are so good. Let's go basic or fundamental level. This usage emphasizes the most important fact or the core nature of a situation. To succeed in this new market, the company must ultimately abandon its outdated manufacturing methods. The philosophy the, the philosophy suggests that the find peace one must ultimately that to find peace, love and peace, one must ultimately abandon all attachment to material wealth. A scientist must ultimately abandon a theory if the data consistently proves it wrong or not right. Because when the lamp was invented, it was 100, 100 and 100 failures, and then only the number 101 succeeded. So if he had abandoned the creation of the lamp, we will not have lamps today. So sentence adverb, conclusion or summary. Cool. So you can also use ultimately to conclude something. When placed at the beginning of a sentence, ultimately acts as a conjunctive adverb to signal a final decision or overreaching point. So how does that work? Ultimately, the board chose to abandon. Ultimately, the board chose to abandon the merger because the risks outweighed the potential profits. The potential profits. That's a conclusion. Now, ultimately, if the software remains buggy, the developers will have to abandon the current version and start over. Third one. Ultimately, you must abandon the idea that there is a perfect time to start a business. See, ultimately, you must abandon the idea that there is a perfect time to start a business. It's always a perfect time to start a business. Cool? Just start whenever you want to. So this is ultimately. Now, eventually, another adverb finishing with ly. We have many. So eventually, at an unspecified time in the future, following a series of events. This adverb is also used to describe an outcome that happens in the end, especially after a long delay. a series of difficulties, or a long period of time. Examples. In this simulation, the AI eventually abandons the mission if the risk level exceeds 90%. With the rising costs of 2025, more developers are eventually abandoning traditional office space, which is true. People work from home now. The team has eventually abandoned the old code base in favor of a modern framework. So here we are talking about coding, about IT. The crew fought the fire for hours but eventually abandoned the vessel. But they were eventually abandoning their posts one by one as the situation grew more desperate. By the time help arrived, the residents had eventually abandoned all the hope of saving their building. So the building was perhaps in fire, and everybody abandoned all the hope. So they did not hope for good things anymore by the time help arrived. Who is this help? The firemen or the police? Anybody who could eventually extinguish the fire. So if we do not see results by the 23rd, the stakeholders will eventually abandon the venture. If the drought continues, farmers will be eventually abandoning their crops across the region. By this time next year, the company will have eventually abandoned all its plastic packaging. Given enough pressure, the opposition might eventually abandon their stance on the new legislation. Investors have eventually been abandoning. See the tense here? Have eventually been abandoning. So the adverb comes before the verb. The verb being abandoning in its ing form, and then being, we have the be verb here in its past participle form. Okay? Investors have eventually been abandoning their shares as the company's stock continues to decline. Because of the rising sea levels in 2025, coastal residents have eventually been abandoning their ancestral homes. If a project lacks a clear roadmap, the development team eventually abandons it. The pilot will eventually abandon the aircraft if the engine failure cannot be contained. The pilot will eventually abandon, so he will just probably jump from the car. The pilot will eventually abandon the aircraft if the engine failure cannot be contained. Also, he's not inside the car, the aircraft actually. Yeah, so if the mechanical engineers, perhaps, or the mechanics do not fix the engine, he will not be there. He will abandon the aircraft. He will not do anything. If we stranded on that island, we would eventually abandon hope of a quick rescue. If the funding had been cut in January, the scientists would eventually have abandoned the experiment months ago. If they had listened to the warnings last year, they wouldn't be eventually abandoning their investments now. So they would not be abandoning their investments now if they had listened to the warnings last year. Okay? Finally is perhaps the easiest one. You already know this one. Finally is an adverb of finality used to signal the end of a long process, persistent struggle, or numbered sequence. It highlights an outcome reached after significant delay or effort, often implying a sense of competition or relief. It is essential for structuring logical arguments and marking the definitive moment in action. The definitive moment in action, like abandoning a project, becomes permanent. In other words, In other words, for it is essential for structuring logical arguments and marking the definitive moment in action becomes permanent. So when an action becomes permanent. Cool? For example, finally, we finished this paragraph. The crew finally abandons the ship. So we are in a ship now, and the crew decided to abandon. So the crew abandons. The crew abandons the ship. It's happening now, right? Present. So the crew is finally abandoning the ship. Present continuous. The crew has finally abandoned the ship. Present perfect. The crew has finally been abandoning the ship. Present perfect continuous. The crew finally abandoned the ship. The crew was finally abandoning the ship. The crew had finally abandoned the ship before it sank. The crew had finally been abandoning the ship for hours when the rescue arrived. The crew will finally abandon the ship. The crew will finally be abandoning the ship this time tomorrow. By midnight, the crew will have finally abandoned the ship. By sunset, the crew will have finally been abandoning the ship for 3 hours. If a project loses money for a decade, the investors finally abandon it. Zero conditioning. So if a project loses money for a decade, the investors finally abandon it. So if the audit shows a deficit tomorrow, the investors will finally abandon the project. If the market crashed today, the investors would finally abandon the project. If the CEO had resigned in 2024, the investors would finally have abandoned it. If the project had failed its initial test, the investors would finally be abandoning it now. If the company had lost its primary funding last year, the employees would be looking for new jobs today. Lastly, so we have two more. Cool. So every single list will have five adverbs, and then so five adverbs, and then in our next class, I'm gonna show you how to I'm gonna give you a scenario, so you're gonna learn a vocabulary about that scenario, and then it's gonna be an easy one. It can be perhaps going to the bank, in a hospital, or I don't know, in sports, playing soccer. It could be anything. And then you're gonna learn the vocabulary of that specific scenario, and then you're gonna write different type of writing. Then it can be an essay, can be a letter, can be an email, can be anything. Okay, it's just a matter of writing as much as you possibly can in order to fix all these concepts, and then you must be using these adverbs. Ultimately, what you want to do is you want to be able to say them fluently. Cool. So let's go. Lastly is an adverb used to introduce the final point in a list, a concluding argument, or the last item in a sequence. While similar to finally, it is specifically focused on enumeration and order rather than the emotional relief or the end of a long struggle. It signals the reader or listener that the upcoming information is the closing element of the current discussion. So, lastly, the crew abandons the ship. Lastly, the crew is abandoning the ship. Lastly, the crew has abandoned the ship. Lastly, the crew has been abandoning the ship. Lastly, the crew abandoned the ship. Lastly, the crew was abandoning the ship. Lastly, the crew had abandoned the ship before it sank. Lastly, the crew had been abandoning the ship for hours when the rescue arrived. Lastly, the crew will abandon the ship. Lastly, the crew will be abandoning the ship this time tomorrow. By midnight, the crew will have lastly abandoned the ship. See, so I can use lastly in the beginning or in the middle as well. Now, lastly. So by sunset, the crew will have lastly been abandoning the ship for 3 hours. Lastly, if a project loses money for a decade, the investors abandon it. Lastly, if the audit shows a deficit tomorrow, the investors will abandon the project. Lastly, if the market crashed today, the investors would abandon the project. Second conditional. Lastly, if the CEO had resigned in 2024, had resigned in 2024, the investors would have abandoned it. Third condition. Lastly, if the project had failed its initial test, the investors would be abandoning it now. Lastly, if the company had lost its primary funding last year, the employees would be looking for new jobs today. And then subsequently, it's the last adverb of this list. I think we have five. Yes, five. So let's go. Subsequently is an adverb used to indicate that an action happened after something else. For example, I was teaching you the finally adverb, and subsequently I showed you the lastly adverb. Subsequently is an adverb used to indicate that an action happened after something else. It functions as a formal transition, connecting two events in a chronological sequence, while finally suggests the end of a long process. Subsequently focuses on the logical what happened next. Subsequently, the crew abandons the ship. Subsequently, the crew is abandoning the ship. Subsequently, the crew has abandoned the ship. Subsequently, the crew has been abandoning the ship. Subsequently, the crew abandoned the ship. Subsequently, the crew was abandoning the ship. Subsequently, the crew had abandoned the ship before it sank. Subsequently, the crew had been abandoning the ship for hours when the rescue arrived. Subsequently, the crew will abandon the ship. Subsequently, the crew will be abandoning the ship this time tomorrow. By midnight, the crew will have subsequently abandoned the ship. By sunset, the crew will have subsequently been abandoning the ship for 3 hours. If a project loses money for a decade, the investors subsequently abandon it. If the audit shows a deficit tomorrow, the investors will subsequently abandon the project. If the market crashed today, the investors would subsequently abandon the project. If the CEO had resigned in 2024, the investors would subsequently have abandoned it. If the project had failed its initial test, the investors would subsequently be abandoning it now. If the company had lost its primary funding last year, the employees would subsequently be looking for new jobs today. Cool? So that's how we use these adverbs. You will probably find more ways to use it, but these are the most common ones. And then the good thing is that you have already seen how to use the adverb in all tenses, right? So the tense changes, the adverb doesn't. Cool? What changes in a tense is the way, well, first and foremost, what we are talking about, of course, and secondly, the verb, right? Abandons. See? Lastly, the crew abandons the ship. The crew is abandoning, has been abandoning, abandoned the ship. The crew was abandoning the ship. The crew had abandoned the ship before it sank. Right? So, yeah, that's it for today, folks. Don't forget if you want to look if you do not want to download this shit, it's okay. You just copy and then that's all fine. However, if you want to download it, just click on the button somewhere here in the video, and then you will download it, and then you're gonna have it. Just write, make summaries, and do whatever you want to do in order to fix these concepts. Okay, they are extremely important. And in our next class, we are gonna have vocabulary. So vocabulary. I will see you soon. Bye bye.